Thank you very much, Kayla. As Kayla was saying, I've been asked to talk on the question of what's so good about democracy, which is obviously a huge subject. So I'm going to have to skate over the issues very quickly. Could I have the first slide, please? So just to remind you, I think you've already had a session this morning on what we mean by democracy, but just to pick out two or three important points. To my way of thinking, the most important thing about democracy is that it's a system of government and opposition, that the decisions of government can be contested by the opposition. And that really means that political power is held by elected representatives, not, for example, by one political party or by military, religious, or hereditary leaders. It obviously requires free and fair elections. One of the ways in which one-party systems operate is that they rig elections. They don't make them free and fair. So democracy requires free and fair elections. It also requires political equality. It requires all adults to be able to participate on equal terms, freedom of expression, and no governmental political censorship of the media. Could I have the next slide, please? If you look around the world at countries that can be called democracies, this is a map from a US independent organization called Freedom House, which looks at, tries to measure the status of democracy in different countries. I think the green ones are the democratic countries, the purple ones are the non-democratic countries, and the mustard-colored ones are democracies, but with some qualifications. I always think this map is a little bit misleading, actually, because a number of the large countries like Canada and the US, Greenland sticks out there, are democracies. But as we'll see, most countries in the world are not democracies. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what's so good about democratic government? And there are two possible sorts of answers that you can give to that question. One is that you can value the results of democratic government, or you can value the intrinsic features of democratic government. It's a bit like buying a car. You can buy a car because it gets you effectively from A to B, or you can buy a car because of its intrinsic features, like the fact that its steering is good or it's very comfortable to ride in and so on. So we can look at democracy from these two aspects. Could I have the next slide, please? So in terms of valuing the results, does it get you from A to B? I'm going to look under two headings, economic prosperity on the one hand and population health on the other. So could I have the next slide, please? Now, I'm going to slow down a little because this slide and the next couple of slides are important, but they get a bit crowded. So I'll just talk you through these. So on the left-hand side, we can divide countries into three broad groups. Those that were democracies in 1950 and have remained stable democracies ever since. Those who were not democracies in 1950 but have become democracies since and have been relatively stable. And then thirdly, non-democratic countries or countries that are unstable in some way. So we can divide countries into those three broad groups. And along the top, I've divided the countries into low and middle income countries on the one hand and high income countries on the other. This is the International Monetary Fund definition, which says that your high income, if your income per head is about £9,000 or more. And then that gives you the nice 6 cells into which you can put your different countries. I've just put some specimen countries here, but could we have the next slide, please? Because I've then tried to populate this with as many countries around the world as I could get into these slides. And if you look at that slide, you'll see on the top right that the high income countries are also the stable democracies, the countries that were democracies in 1950 and have remained stable ever since. If you look at the bottom left, you can see that the low to middle income countries are by and large non-democratic or unstable democracies. Now, life is never quite so simple as to divide us into two groups. So if you look at the bottom right, for example, you can see that there are some high income countries that are non-democracies, but by and large, these tend to be oil-rich states or rather special cases like Singapore. What can we conclude from a table like this? Well, the one thing that stands out is that democracy is associated with economic prosperity and non-democracy is associated with lack of prosperity. Now, of course, there's a huge discussion as to whether it's the prosperity that brings about the democracy or the democracy that brings about the prosperity. but there's no doubt that democracy is associated with prosperity. Of course, prosperity is not the only thing in life. What about health? Could I have the next slide, please? And here again, on the left-hand side, I've divided the countries into the same three groups. But at the top, I've made a distinction between high infant mortality countries and low infant mortality countries. Infant mortality is defined as child death within a year of birth, and I've drawn a line at 5 per 1,000 live births, 0.5%, essentially. And there again, you can see a very similar picture to the picture that we saw in the case of prosperity, namely in the top right, those countries which have low infant mortality are the democracies, and those countries down in the bottom left, which are non-democratic or unstable, tend to have high infant mortality. Top left, just to note, notice that the USA has just above 5 per 1,000 live births. It has 6 per 1,000 live births, but that's an interesting exception, which we may want to come back to in discussion. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I've said at the beginning there are two possible answers, types of answers to the question. Value results, I've already talked about. Does it get you from A to B? What about the intrinsic features? So could I have the next slide, please? So here I'm going to look under the intrinsic features at two things: political freedoms on the one hand and equal rights on the other. So could I have the next slide, please? So I've chosen a slide of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. These are East German citizens tearing down the wall, which kept them in East Germany and which was policed very heavily. About 12 years before the Berlin Wall fell, I did visit East Berlin, and I have to say that it was a grey and joyless place. But more importantly, it was a place that was constant surveillance of political attitudes and behaviour of its citizens. So East Germany was not a democracy. And what democracy gives you, by contrast, and what these East German citizens are struggling for and tearing down the wall, are those political freedoms of the right to oppose government and the freedom from government surveillance. Could I have the next slide, please? The second sort of intrinsic feature of democracy that I've called attention to is equal rights. Here's a women's suffrage demonstration in Hyde Park in 1908. The characteristic feature, the distinctive feature of democracy is that everybody has equal rights of participation in political life. In fact, you can tell the story almost of democracy of the spread of voting rights. At one stage in the United Kingdom, only those who were relatively rich had the right to vote and participate in politics. And gradually over the course of a century or so, that right spread out to the full population. So democracy has, I think, this intrinsic and very important feature that it gives equal rights to everyone. Could I have the next slide, please? So I've been talking right in the center here about the values of democracy, whether the results or the intrinsic values. If I understand it correctly, your task is going to be to try and think about how these values play into our thinking about voters, parties, parliament and government. That's a very demanding task, but at the present time, I can't think of one that's more important. Thank you very much for your attention.